everyone. Good morning, good evening, whatever works for you. So I'm Ricardo Silvestri, and welcome to one more session of the Logic and Religion webinar. This is a very special session because we are having Bo Mo from San Jose State University, and he's going to speak a bit about Chinese philosophy. He's an expert in Chinese philosophy and Chinese logic, so it's a very special session for us. And my friend Anand Vaidya is going to chair the session. So that's it. I hope everyone has a very good session. After Bomo speaks, we're going to have a discussion. And that's it. So Anand, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Ricardo. And hi, everybody. I'm reporting to you from Athens. We're all global, so this should be a very interesting event. Let me begin by saying that we will have Bo speak for 50 minutes, and let me begin with an introduction. And then after he speaks, we'll go right into questions for about 15 to 30 minutes. So Bo Mu is professor of philosophy at San Jose State University in Northern California. He is the author of several monograph books, including Cross-Tradition Engagement in Philosophy, a Constructive Engagement Account, in 2020, Semantic-Truth Approaches in Chinese Philosophy, a Unifying Pluralist Account in 2018, Substantive Perspectivism in 2009. Bo Mu is contributing editor of a number of scholarly anthologies, including Philosophy of Language, Chinese Philosophy, Constructive Engagement of Analytic and Conceptual Approaches in Philosophy from the Vantage Point of Comparative Philosophy, co-edited with Richard Thiessen in 2013. History of Chinese and Philosophy, 2009. Davidson's Philosophy and Chinese Philosophy, Constructive Engagement, 2006. The Two Roads to Wisdom, Chinese and Analytic Philosophical Traditions. So Bo will speak for 50 minutes, and 50 that is, and then we'll go from there into questions. Bo, the floor is yours, so please take it away.
Okay. Let me first express my appreciation to the Professor Ricardo Silvestri, the invitation. So allow me to have this good opportunity to share my thought and hear the criticism. And thank you, Ricardo and Anand, and my colleague in the San Jose State, and Francisco. He's one of the co-organizers. Okay, my talk entitled is Ultimate-Unspeakable Paradox and the Refined Principle of the Non-Contradiction. Subtitle title is from Lao Zi and Aristotle to a holistic double reference vantage point. Let me first highlight what I'm going to do and give you some explanation and more explanation in the subsequent discussion. Can we talk about ultimate? Like the ultimate God or the ultimate reality Dao. So by the ultimate, as I cover all this kind of ultimate reality, ultimate thing in the different tradition. Can we talk about the ultimate with contradictory features in a consistent way as guided by a refined principle of non-contradiction? This talk is to explain a refined principle of the non-contradiction from a holistic double reference vantage point. It is to capture the double reference point of the Lao Zi, the opening statement of the Dao-De-Jing, and the central point of the Aristotle's classical presentation of the principle of the non-contradiction. Dissolving the ultimate unspeakable paradox, the address to refine the principle of non-contradiction can guide us to talk about the real contradiction with the ultimate in a non-contradictory and insight way. Let me give the short note here at the start. The dissolving the case, I think is here, generally speaking, we talk about the ultimate in the different tradition, including the philosophy philosophical and religion tradition. In my opinion, dissolving case is tougher and stronger for the bottom-up ultimate the Dao in the Taoist sense, in which we can talk about the same natural world. So I don't want to mystify the very notion of the Dao. So to the people working in this area, we can highlight the nature of the Dao in a plain word. It's just the same natural world around us. The dissolving case is tougher for this bottom-up ultimately, because bottom-up, you see, is not from top down, from some theoretical speculation specify what ultimate is, including the God. We have a Bible test. The dissolving case is less tough for the top-down ultimate as a God in his traditional sense in two ways. Given the controversy over whether the same God is talked about among, say, Christians, Muslims, and the Jews. It's a controversial issue. People among these different religions or tradition group not talk about exactly the same God. I think that case is actually less tough in the following sense. When you talk about the God in the different tradition, we're not talking about the same thing. So there's no contradiction. Okay. There's in another way is the dissolving case is less tough. Even within the same God-related tradition, Christianity is something like it's a textual basis of top and down character leaves less room for a contradictory identity of the God. So eventually, for example, for the people within the same Christian tradition or Muslim or Jew tradition, they have the top and down, the Bible or New Testament, the text. Those texts leaving the less room, not no room, less room for contradictory identity of the God. So I give the quick note here. So let me first highlight my strategy in my subsequent discussion. Number one, I give the philosophical interpretation of the Lao Zi Taoist treatment of what is often labeled the ultimate unspeakable paradox, which is highlighted in the opening statements of the Dao-De-Jing. Usually probably if you look at the literature, you often heard of the opening statement, Dao that can be spoken of, it's not genuine Dao, something about that. I will give a further detailed analysis of that. So I say at the very beginning, at the very opening statement of the Taoist classical text, Dao-De-Jing, Lao Zi has already delivered his insight how to dissolve its ultimate unspeakable paradox. I would say my view is different from some ready-made popular interpretation. So you will see. And then I will give an elaboration of the central point of the Aristotle's classical characterization and the presentation of the principle of non-contradiction, which is to, in my opinion, constitute the core point of the principles of non-contradiction, and thus the real target of any genuine objection of the principle of the non-contradiction. And then I give a kind of the engaging cross-tradition examination. Both Lao Zi and Aristotle point to the same double reference feature of the people's basic employment of the language. What's a people's basic employment language? Very simple. Something is a set of object. Every people do it. When you get up early morning or way down before you go to the bed, I would say more than 99% of your utterance is a token of the people's basic employment language. Something is said about the object. It's possible people just say, for example, some people call me Bo. All of a sudden, come across me, bow, and then say nothing. So that's not a token of the basic employment language. It's possible, but it's not typical, okay? And then I present a refined principle of the non-contradiction characterized from the holistic double reference vantage point. There are 2 points here. The double reference identity of an object that is talked about in people's basic employment of language, the semantic whole reference and the specific part reference as made at the same time, rather than one by one. So that's one crucial point. That's why it's called double reference. So when the object is talked about in such context, I mean, in the context, token context of the people's basic employment language, which is semantically and logically prior to a predicative comments. The second point, a real contradiction associated with an object in the world primarily comprises referentially identified contradictory aspect, if any, of the object, such as what is constitute the real change and motion. The human language, through his double reference power, can talk about the real contradiction as a distinct double reference identities of what the subject referring term duly referred to in a non-contradictory way. Okay, let me start from step 1. I have a number of the notes. Okay, to avoid putting too many cards on the table in this relatively short presentation with his focus, for some of the addressed conceptual resources, their detailed discussion are given as follows. I provide you with a 2 precision reading material. So some detail you can find there. Although I will not repeat what I already said, I give you new interpretation, but basic material, so you can see there. For detailed discussion of the Lao's the truth pursuing language engagement with the ultimate reality, which show how the semantic truth of the unspeakable is possible. See the section 6, especially subsection 6.2 of my monograph book, Semantic-Truth Approach in Chinese Philosophy, Unifying Pluralist Account. For a detailed discussion of the double reference idea, see the section 3.2 of my recent article, an enhanced account of the relative identity, double reference starting point, and the dual track feature forthcoming in the history and the philosophy of the logic. As for how this approach can constructively engage with dialecticism, agreement, and the disagreement, this probably we don't have time to touch that topic. The topic to be focused on somewhere else. Okay. Now, we start with Lao's vision. So Lao's the Taoist treatment of what is often labeled ultimate unspeakable paradox, which is highlighted in the opening statement of the Dao-De-Jing. Here I provide a philosophical interpretation. I would like to say it's a controversial issue. This is my, for one thing, it's my view. And for another thing, it's a philosophical interpretation. So when I emphasize the philosophical interpretation, I mean the 2 things. When I give my interpretation, I'm afraid using the contemporary resources if they can enhance our understanding. Second, we talk about the philosophical interpretation. That means we try to identify some what is implied in the Dao-De-Jing text. The purpose is not give a purely historical description to figure out what is really running in the Lao's head. Probably some deep implication by the text had yet to be really thought about by Lao Zi as a historical figure. But the purpose here is not give a purely historical description. We try to, but we still not to give the wild interpretation. We still based on the text. It's another issue whether whether or not, and to what extent the historical figure Lao Zi, how much really thought about during the 2000 years ago. That's another issue. By the way, it's controversial who is a genuine author of the Dao-De-Jing. So here I'm using the name Lao Zi just as a figure speaker for the idea delivered in the text Dao-De-Jing. We put aside that historical controversy, who is a genuine Lao Zi. So here, when I use a Lao Zi say this, Lao Zi say that, I mean the Dao-De-Jing, the text as a whole, deliver this message or this. Okay, just for the convenience, I use the term Lao Zi. So one of the Lao Zi's the most fascinating teaching in the Dao-De-Jing is the first pair of the 12 Chinese character pointized aphorisms in chapter 1. In the Chinese, 道可道，非常道，名可名，非常名. So here I use Latin transliteration. Here's the Chinese original. So it's open to the scholar who know Chinese or not know Chinese. They can have the text basis for the discussion. So to avoid confusion, in my pinyin transliteration of the directly or indirectly cited passage from the Dao-De-Jing here, the transliteration of the Chinese character with the first letter being capitalized is used to indicate the character, that Chinese character in the relevant context of the Chinese original is used as a noun. So look at here, when I use the Dao, it's a first letter in the capital case. The last one, Dao, is a capital case. Here, you see, when you look at the Chinese original, Dao, ke Dao, 非常道. There's a 3 Dao appear here. The second appearance of the Dao actually is using as a verb. So I'm using small case rather than capital case. So by same token, 名可名，非常名. The first 名, that means the name, using as a name. Second appearance of the 名, that's using as a word, can be speaker. Okay. Let me skip this Chinese original, go to the first look at the traditional, I would say it's kind of the standard translation in the literature. Probably people are familiar with Professor Wing-Chi Chang, that is a quite classical source book for Chinese philosophy. It's published by Princeton University Press in the 1963. So I just pick up the 3. So these are 3 translators. Quite probably some of you familiar with this name. Okay, this D.C. Lao, Liu Dianjue, the translation is this. The way that can be spoken of is not constant way. So that means the constant way cannot be really spoken of. So look at the Professor Wing-Chi Chang's translation. Dao, probably you often heard of this. That's quite representative. The Dao that can be told of in language is not eternal Dao. So that means the eternal Dao cannot be told of in language. When we look at the more recent translation by the Roger Amos and the David Hoare, they say, we making the Dao that can be put into the words is not really we making. So that means the genuine way of the making cannot be put into the words. Okay, this is a standard typical translation you can see in the English literature. I partially disagree to this traditional standard translation or interpretive translation, partially. But however, they're partially right. The point, some very important, the message, substantial significant message delivered in the opening statement of the Dao-De-Jing, has been ignored. So it's a double point. They only capture one point while ignoring the other. So that's give people the appearance there's ultimate, the unspeakable. Okay. So here is my is a translation. We just consider first statement, 道可道非常道. I give you can say it's giving the partially literal translation. You see it's the first three Chinese character, 道可道. Literal translation is very clear, straightforward. Dao can be talked about. Okay, it's at the very beginning, Lao Zi make this very clear, straightforward statement. Dao can be talked about. So here is roughly is my paraphrase. The Dao is duly speakable in the two senses, as suggests in the context of the opening statement, as well as shown in the whole Dao-De-Jing context. In what sense the Dao can be talked about, speak of? I avoid using the too much jargon in the philosophy language. I try to deliver the point in the plain words. Simply speaking, Dao as a whole can be rigidly designated. So you can ignore this jargon. Rigid designation is highlighted by the Kripke in his work in the naming necessity. But basically, we say Dao as a whole can be talked about. As a show in the whole text of the Dao-De-Jing, right? It's Lao Zi talk about the Dao. They are not talk about the Burger's Dao, genuine Dao throughout the Dao-De-Jing. So Dao can be as a whole can be talked about, while his specific parts being descriptively denoted in focus at the same time in distinct contexts. You see, Lao Zi is talk about a lot about the Dao. In each of those many statements about the Dao, he focuses on different aspect, different dimension, different layer, and literally, usually deliver in the predicate, in the sentential predicate. But however, my point is stronger than that, because I argue that the Lao Zi make a double reference. I have a textual evidence, you will see. Okay, so basically, Dao can be talked about in the two senses. For one thing, Dao as a whole can be talked about. Okay, that's what Lao Zi is doing throughout the text of the Dao-De-Jing. So what Lao Zi talk about is not a Burger's Dao, first Dao is a genuine Dao. And in many passages, the Lao Zi in the Dao-De-Jing talk about this or that specific aspect of the Dao-De-Jing, okay, in two senses. So 道可道非常道. The the later three Chinese character actually I cited traditional translation. They just focus on a second message delivered by the later three Chinese character. That later three character actually lack of his subject, but in the context, the traditional translator make up that the missing subject. They say Dao that can be talked about is not genuine Dao. Okay, they ignoring the first three character as the message explicitly delivered by the first three Chinese character. Dao can be talked about. They change into the kind of the modifier clause. Dao that can be talked about is not genuine Dao. Okay, here is my paraphrase. Dao can be talked about, okay, but the Dao that has been talked about specifically denoted in the various finite description in language, it's not external Dao. So it's how to understand it's not. You can understand it in a two ways. Either it's not identical with the external Dao, right? That involves the relative identity. So that's probably another topic. But however, in my second pre-session writing, you can see the detail about the resources of the enhanced relative identity. Okay, it's a not identical Dao, or the Dao that has been talked about specifically in language does not exhaust eternal Dao. I think that makes sense, right? It's a Dao as a whole. It's a keep changing. There's a boundary, is a expand, and in the motion in the change. So simply speaking, you can say this infinite dimension of the Dao. So any Dao has been characterized in finite terms, cannot exhaust the infinite dimension of the Dao. Makes sense, right? So I would like to say, so this is the Dao with his eternal dimension of the Dao is unspeakable in the sense of that it cannot be descriptively exhausted, but so far giving description. So that makes sense. So traditional translation just highlight, emphasize the second part, ignoring the first part. So here's a question. What's the rationale here? How is it possible for the same Dao as a whole to be talked about while having his distinct or even contradictory aspect, dimension, also talk about in a non-contradictory way? So in both sub-statement of the opening statement of the Dao-De-Jing, the same Dao as a whole is a rigidly, or as a whole is a designate, but the distinct dimensions are specifically pointed to and denoted. So it's a so far descriptively denoted dimension as a collection of all so far descriptively denoted specific part, and the external dimension as a collection of all the dynamic, never-ending parts. Okay, so which are predictively commented respectively as is speakable and unspeakable. So basically, in the plain words, Lao Zi point, the Dao can be talked about in a formational way. So the Dao have his speakable dimension and unspeakable dimension. So when you make a double reference, talk about the Dao as a whole, and then focus on the speakable finite aspect. So the Dao is speakable. So when you turn this it's a subject predicate statement into the identity statement, let's say the Dao is identical with a collection of the speakable regarding that the finite descriptive dimension. Okay, and then the Dao is unspeakable regarding his infinite dimension. So as a result, the two statements are not really contradictory. But in so saying, I do not mean there's no contradiction here. But point is, traditionally people focus on contradictory is a character as delivered by the predicative, the comments. But my point here is a contradiction aspect appear as a referential stage. So there's a double reference. And then the two statement, when you say the Dao is speakable and the Dao is unspeakable, the two statements here are not talking about exactly the same thing. There's the two subject in the two statement here have the two different double reference identities. So in the following, I will give a more detailed explanation here. Let me cite another very interesting passage from chapter 14 of the Dao-De-Jing. Actually, that at that point is I think is that's one of the Lao Zi's contribution to its how to resolving is the ultimate paradox, unspeakable paradox. And also, in my opinion, is a kind of the contribution to the philosophy language. So I said here is a Chinese original. We skip this part, go to my English translation. Okay. Why this passage is very interesting? Because Lao Zi gives the 3 double reference name instead of just the Dao. Actually, he suggests 3 distinct names. Each of them designate Dao as a whole, and at the same time, specifically denote one specific dimension of the Dao. So as a whole, it gives 3 representatives the double reference name. Okay. I just highlight something here. Okay. So Lao Zi say in the chapter 14, watched but not entirely seen. Its name is Yi. Okay, his point is giving the understanding of the identity Dao. Okay, Dao is not kind of a mysterious Platonic form-like or God-like existing beyond above our sensible worlds. So Dao is a manifest itself through the many individual things in our natural world. The relation between the Dao and the particular thing, that relationship kind of the yin-yang complementary relationship. Okay, each of them without other cannot exist. Okay, so in this way, when you watch, we watch a lot of things in our natural world, right? From a Lao Zi, the Taoist point of view, all these specific individual things is a manifestation of the metaphysical Dao, or you can say it's kind of an individualized Dao. So when the Lao Zi say watched, Dao can be watched, right? Because you watch a lot of specific things. So Lao Zi treat those specific particular things as a manifestation of the Dao rather than something else. So in that way, it's a watched, but not entirely seen, because the Dao as a whole have its infinite dimension. It cannot exhaust it. So Lao Zi just point to that dimension. He gives the name is a Yi. Okay, Yi for one thing, that's the Dao as a whole, and at the same time, descriptively denote that dimension, which is watched but not entirely seen. Okay. Second, listen to but not completely heard. He give this is another dimension of the Dao as a whole. So Lao Zi use another name, the Xi, to refer to that specific. This double reference designates the Dao as a whole, and at the same time specifically denote the collection of all individual things that are listened but not completely heard. So you can see this kind of the finite and the infinite, the combination. So that's so what are denotation? I say on the one hand, it's a designated Dao as a whole. At the same time, denote one open-ended collection of all specific individual things which share these general attributes. And interesting enough, it's Lao Zi still not feel enough to he continue. As for the clutched but not thoroughly gotten, this dimension, he gives the name is a weight. Okay, so basically something you can rely on in the real world, right? But you cannot really got it. Why? Because that dimension as a whole have his finite dimension, also have the infinite dimension. Okay, all these 3 cannot be exhaustively pursued. Okay, so here highlights the infinite dimension, and so that's why it's unexhausted. And then infinite, so as a skip, okay. Infinite and the boundless, it cannot be named. So in that dimension, you cannot be named. So you unspeakable, okay. But however, it's not a totally mysterious out of the people's knowledge and what is speakable. So look at his ending statement. Hold on the Tao of the old in order to master the thing of the present. One can just know the primeval beginnings. It's not a totally, it's still notable, speakable, you see. So this is a very interesting passage in the Dao-De-Jing as given in the chapter 14. I make several, it's a reflective elaboration of the point made by the Lao Zi in the opening chapter and the chapter 14. Also other chapter, our time is short. I cannot give you comprehensive examination, just pick up the most representative passage in the Dao-De-Jing. So in the Lao Zi language engagement, he explicitly addresses what is specifically denoted at the same time, designating the object as a whole. In comparison, contrast to the Gongsun Long, the white horse, what is horse in his white horse, not horse argument. Okay, let me give a short explanation of this this note. Actually, it's 2 weeks ago, I give my talk as there's a symposium conference, a 4-day at the UCLA on history of the logic, and in honor of the is Terence Parsons. Yeah, his book Non-Existent Object. Okay, at that conference, I invited to give a talk. My focus on Gongsun Long's white horse, not horse paradox. So eventually conclusion or basic orientation is similar to here, but the focus is different. Here I focus on the Lao's message, double reference account as delivered in the Chinese classics Dao-De-Jing. But in the Gongsun Long's case, he's probably heard of the Gongsun Long's white horse, not horse. Okay. I think the Lao Zi case is philosophically speaking is more interesting in some connection because you see it's in the Gongsun Long case, he's also emphasized when you denote something, when you talk about the white horse, at the same before you give any subsequent predicative comments, is horse or it's not horse. You need to at first make clear what is the sort. If you want to work on the common aspect between the white horse and the horse, so you should say white horse is horse. If you focus on what is distinct, say the white color, you should say white horse is not identical to horse regarding the attribute of the having the white color. But eventually, Gongsun Long also dissolving that white horse, not horse paradox. Eventually, you can see they talk about the different aspect, say the specific attribute of the horseness and the specific attribute having the white color. These two aspects actually turned out to be not contradictory, okay? But in the Lao Zi case, infinite and finite and infinite, it turned out to be really contradictory. So I would like to say these two cases the philosophical point are the same, but the nature of the two types of the paradox are not the same. So in the Gongsun Long case, white horse, not horse, after Gongsun Long's double reference way of the dissolving that paradox is turned out to be not contradictory, not talk about the contradictory aspect of the white horse at all, because you focus on white color, focus on the horseness. Horseness and the white color are not contradictory, right? But here, the case is stronger. The Lao Zi does talk about finite and the infinite aspect. There turned out to be, you see, as here, is a contradictory, yeah. But that contradictory identify as a referential stage, and then resulting two different double reference identity of the is a subject referring term refer to. Quick note here. So furthermore, both for illustration and for delivering philosophical insight, Lao Zi gives the three representative and sophisticated double reference name, collective name, Yi, Xi, Wei. I briefly highlight the three elaboration points. First, Lao Zi explicitly distinguished the three representative aspect type as the three open-ended sub-collection of the specific aspect of the various particular things as a manifestation of the Dao in his in this natural world to be focused on in reference. Second, the three collective names jointly designate the same Dao as a whole, while at the same time, respectively denoting distinct aspect collections of the specific aspect possessed by the various particular things in this natural world, which are respectively coordinated into the distinct open-ended collections by virtue of their respective shared universal attributes. Okay, I put a universal in italics. I just want to say the term universal here is open to different ontological explanation. Okay, either Platonic realist or the conceptualist or the nominalist interpretation. That's okay. Okay. Third, the three collective names are double reference referring names. Probably I can call it the descriptive designators in the Dao-De-Jing that have their distinct contradictory dimensions as shown by the open-ended coverage boundary of the infinite and the boundless of their respectively denoted sub-collection, which keep changing and are in the motion. Yeah, here we talk about the real contradiction in the real world. It's what that means. Actually, we come across the changing motion, so that involves the real contradiction. Professor Graham Priest, in his well-known book in Contradiction, gives I think in his first edition, 1987, he just talked about the changing, and then in the second edition, he add up two more chapters talking about the motion, talk about the time. But anyway, we just treat these contradictory states involving the changing and the motion are sample of the real contradiction. So here, Lao Zi talk about the real contradiction. The case is a little bit different from other type of the contradiction. For example, people are familiar with liar parallax. So naturally, probably after my talk, people might ask how you would apply the double reference approach to deal with liar parallax. I have something to say. Okay, let me move on. So here is a refined way of the delivering the Lao Zi Taoist point in terms of the enhanced relative identity and double reference resources. So this basically is given in the second pre-session reading. So you can see involves a relative identity. When so in that paper, enhanced account of the relative identity, the subtitle is subtitle is double reference starting point, dual track, right? So here you can see I introduce enhanced relative identity parameter, different from Peter Gage, the traditional notion of the relative identity in the modern logic. In that paper, I explain in detail how it's different. So you can see it's so it skips this technical material. Okay, go to start here from last statement. So when the F and the G here is a lowercase, by the lowercase, basically I mean the specific attributes. And then capital case means they're turning to the general universal attributes. So when the F and the G refer to two contradictory aspects of F of G, and so that give two different double reference identity of what they duly refer to. So the predictively contradictory A and A star talk about address the contradiction in a non-contradictory way. Okay, let me using that resources to deliver the Lao Zi point here. So you can say I use a term U is a designated ultimate. Okay, whereas the S is a term denoting the collection of the speakable things. Okay, F is a term as finite. Okay, finite thing, specific finite thing. So capital F is a term as a universal attribute identifying constant. Okay, so in this way, UF and the U in F, so you can say they give the two different double reference identity of what they duly refer to. Predictively contradictory A and A star actually talk about the address the contradiction in a non-contradictory way. So this point I will give you more explanation. Let me go to the Aristotle's case. So an elaboration of the central point of Aristotle's classical characterization and the presentation of the principle of non-contradiction, the core of the PNC and thus the real target of any genuine rejection of the PNC. So Aristotle, roughly Lao Zi and Aristotle roughly are contemporary. Roughly it's 400 years before Common Era. So they're roughly the contemporary, although they do not know each other during the ancient time. So Aristotle's classical presentation of the point of the PNC as giving the metaphysical grammar in here. So I believe a lot of you are already familiar with this classical presentation. So Aristotle say, so I highlight something we need to pay attention to. Evidently, then such principle is the most certain of all. Which principle is this is? Let us proceed to say, it is that the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject and in the same respect. Okay, we must presuppose to guard against the dialectical objections, any further qualification which might be added. There are several significant features, implications that strongly contribute to the core point of the principle of the non-contradiction as captured in the Aristotle's classical presentation. First, what the PNC is to capture is a guidance of the how to adequately, that means without self-contradiction for the sake of the mutual understanding and the effective engaging criticism, say something about an object that is a talk about and refer to, given that what the subject here in the Aristotle's text means is an object that is a talk about and is commented on in a statement. So in so doing, what is said about is the same subject in his same respect, in my terminology, aspect, what dimension or layer, that are jointly referred to or thought about at the same time, right as a predicative the common referring stage. Third point, the identity of the object that is a talk about is referentially identified in a sense. The same attribute cannot at the same time be attributed and not attributed, be said to belong or not belong to the same subject and in the same respect. So that is primarily the identified attributes are considered to specifically and internally belong to the addressed object in his addressed respect. that is referentially identified at the base level, rather than being imposed abstractly and externally through the general term as a grammatical predicates. Although the secondarily such attributes can be predictably identified through the grammatical predicates, in the sense that such predicately identified general attributes can be viewed as expanded aspect of the object under examination in the following sense. It is located as an interface between the object and the human predication through the general concept.
Oh, we have 2 minutes. Please wrap up.
Okay, let me very quickly. So the classical presentation of the central point of the principle of non-contradiction does not exclude, but can include or cover the case in which one talk about the referentially identified genuine contradictory attribute as a contradictory aspect of the same object as a whole in a non-contradictory way. Okay, let me skip this. So the both Lao Zi and Aristotle point to the same double reference feature of the people's basic employment of the language. Something is said about object. In the Aristotle case, the referentially sensitive, the core point of the PNC is directly and explicitly characterized and presented in a general way, which in the Lao Zi case, the PNC is indirectly and implicitly addressed through the Lao Zi's specific treatment of the dissolving the lead to the ultimate unspeakable paradox. So one central connection point lies in their shared, the crucial double reference point. So although two roughly contemporary around the 400, 200 before common year reflectively capture the same double reference point of the human language and the reflective understanding, although they are geographically, linguistically, and culturally separated from each other, although then there are no way for their real life communication. Okay. Yeah, I can stop here. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Bo.
Yeah. Okay.
Excellent job. Very clear presentation. I totally agree with you. Okay, so for people who want to ask a question, please use the raise hand function under the reactions tab. I'm going to read the first question from Anderson Ferreira because he doesn't have a microphone. So Bo, the first question is, could we relate the participation of the Tao in things with the eidos in Aristotle's metaphysics? I mentioned Lao Zi above when he talks about the unborn and the unchangeable being before all the things which does born and does change. So does the Tao exist before those, but being the same part of which is unborn, unchangeable, or even separated from that one?
Yes. So I would like to say by the term, umbrella term infinite in this text to cover both in the future and in the past. Before in the Lao Zi term is a wu, nothing, non-being. Before is a you, before our human being realize the Dao. So it's umbrella or all those is covered by the infinite dimension. So its answer is a yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions? Kishore?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Thank you. This is a wonderful, very, very clear presentation. And I would like to ask you, you have mentioned that both Lao Zi, Master Lao, and Aristotle probably belongs to a similar period of time, but had no way of knowing anything about each other, which is almost certainly true. But I'd like to mention that Lao Zi still probably had knowledge of the principle of non-contradiction from a different source.
Mhm.
There is evidence. The principle of non-contradiction is known in Sanskrit as avirodha. That is, a means not, virodha means contradiction. So the principle of avirodha has been very widely and explicitly stated in Sanskrit philosophical writings from before, I can definitely claim with complete certainty, from before the time of Lao Zi, in numerous Sanskrit works. And in a very large number of Sanskrit works, the topic of Brahman is discussed, and Brahman is also described as indescribable and unspeakable. And there is a large body of literature on that could have been, there is evidence, according to some Chinese scholars like Wing Tzu-Chan that you mentioned, that Lao Tzu probably spent 12 years in Tibet. Now, he's not claiming that this is actually the fact, but he's saying, Wing Tzu-Chan, very respected scholar, whom you mentioned, that this is possible. Now, 12 years, if he did in Tibet, that brings him quite close to India, geographically, and the possibility of communication, opens up, because the literature on Brahman is definitely existent for a long time, well before the time of Lao Tzu. And if it did make it all the way to Tibet, that close to India, then the communication, becomes, real. I mean, the possibility becomes quite interesting. Anyway, in that literature, there is a theory that sounds very similar to your explanation. Your attempt to remove, which I'd like to mention, if you like. Sorry. So in that literature, the way they try to resolve the contradiction, apparent contradiction, is by making the distinction between transcendence, which seems to be implied in your presentation as well, and immanence. That is, when we talk about Brahman moves and then moves not, moves is in the immanent aspect of Brahman, the absolute, because everything in the universe is grounded in Brahman, the absolute. And they do move. The phenomenal things, the things we experience, they do move, they do change. So that is the immanent aspect, but that has no conflict with the transcendent aspect of Brahman, which is absolute and unmoving. So that's how they remove the sense of contradiction as a double reference. And that sounded quite similar to your explanation. So what I want to say, the principle of non-contradiction could possibly be known to Lao Tzu, not from Aristotle, I agree with you on that, but from a different source, if he did make all the way to Tibet and get in contact with the Sanskrit, Indian philosophical tradition, which was existent for a long time from before Lao Tzu's time. Thank you.
Actually, I agree with you. You see, I don't have time to explicitly deliver in my presentation. Actually, in my paper, I have some comments on this. Actually, it's the principle of non-contradiction as presented by Aristotle is not kind of the only belong to the Western tradition. It's a human commonwealth. Not merely in the sense this could be shared by all throughout the world, and also 2,000 years ago in a different tradition. That's why they either explicitly or implicitly, directly or indirectly shared by all the human beings in this natural world. Because that kind of the principle is intrinsically, I think, embodied in the human language, have that kind of power. And that's actually that's related to the very notion of the double reference. Okay, the ancient people does not use the terminology double reference. This is my contemporary terminology. But the point is this. As I mentioned, a double reference phenomenon and the feature is not something neither odd, new, nor a stranger. People do it. Almost 99% people doing that. And in our language basic language employment. For example, when I say, I give you two sentences, boy is sit here. Boy is somehow the instructor. You see, it's in both cases, we use a ball in both statements, talk about the same ball as a whole, right? But in each of the statements, you focus on some specific aspect. It's in the ball is sit here, you focus on some specific aspect, attribute, sit here. And then if you want to focus on my multiple identity, you say, boy, the some of this in the structure. So you are doing the double reference. Other people doing in that. So this is kind of the power in our human language. Either it's Greek, Indian language, and the Chinese language. So it's so I agree with you. Yeah. So in that sense, I think it's relatively unimportant whether or not those ancient guys really physically contact with each other, because it's intrinsically embodied in the power of the human language. So difference lies in is whether or not, to what extent you explicitly deliver. I think that's Aristotle's contribution. They highlight that in an explicit language in a co-side way. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Jasvant? We can't hear you, Jasvant. You have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Jasvant.
I hope now it is.
Yep, better.
You see, the point that I can summarize is that contradictory statements, they can be easily covered by anekantvad, what is called in Jainism, and that covers the whole thing.
I think you're frozen, Jasvant. Keep going.
No, that's all what I wanted to say. That anekantvad or multiple
Okay.
views, they can cover the contradiction, the whole thing at a stretch. A single sentence cannot give the clear picture of the whole thing at a time. So you have to have different sentences over there, and sometimes one may feel that they are contradictory. So the common example that is given in a blind person touching the elephant, and one touches the tail of that one, and he says the elephant is very thin. The other is touching the leg of that one, and that fellow is saying it is very thick. So those two are relative terms. So that is what is covered in anekantvad in Jain philosophy, as far as I understand it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any other questions?
Welcome.
Other questions? I have a question, Bo.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to say that well, it's a comment also. I mean, I thought it was a very, very clear argument. I found it very compelling. Like, as soon as you started talking in the beginning, I kind of thought, oh, this makes sense. I've seen those passages interpreted in other ways, but I found the attempt to talk about the three occurrences of Dao in terms of the capitalization and the non-capitalization, and then the account of referring to the whole versus talking about aspects to be quite convincing. And so I feel that this kind of model of interpretation is quite useful and probably applies to many other cases, or can be used as a way of trying to interpret other phenomena, as I think, Kishore was kind of pointing to, that this sort of thing occurs in other traditions and it can also be used. But now I want to ask a question sort of in the other direction, which is, I think sometimes philosophers are inclined to sort of want to make something paradoxical because they can find on the surface reading of it something that looks paradoxical. And then on the other hand, I think there's a tendency sometimes to look at certain statements that are seemingly paradoxical and basically remove the paradoxical nature of them in order to make a sense of them. So the question I have for you, because you have a lot of knowledge of a lot of traditions, so this is a general question, is do you find that there are examples where you would say the surface seeming paradoxality of the thing is to be preserved, actually. And that although there are techniques like Sapta Bhangi or Anekantavada or any number of things, and even though there are techniques, double reference, that can be used to uncode them so that maybe they're not so paradoxical and we can make coherent sense of them the way you did, that would really not be the right thing to do, because these genuinely are intent. Are there any examples for you of that kind? I mean, I'm just generally, because you know so much, I'm curious if other cases might be the ones where, no, it actually does make sense. Some people say Nagarjuna's, statements about ultimate reality could be interpreted this way. Maybe that's something, but are there examples you would say are really genuinely contradictions and they should be left that way?
Yes. In my presentation, I think I partially respond that question. So let me reiterate my point. Yeah, first thing is as far as general applicability of this double reference treatment, to my knowledge, so far so good. I already analyzed, so for example, in the I address the two types of the paradox, is a white horse, not horse, and the ultimate unspeakable paradox. I already give you a sample how to deal with. Actually, you can see through this double reference resources and the vantage point, and the white horse, not horse paradox turned out to be not really about a contradiction. Right? When I say, you see, talk about the white horse is horse, white horse not horse, and the white horse is horse regarding some common attributes shared by all the horses, right? And then white horse it's not having the horse regarding this attribute of the having white color. So it turned out to be not really about the contradiction state. However, the case in the ultimate unspeakable paradox is really about the contradiction. But the question is, where is that the contradiction is located? It's the traditional, you see, first thing I admit, I honor the real contradiction in the world. So in that connection, I agree with dialecticism, right? But how, on the other hand, I think it's these paradoxes of different type can be dissolved in a distinct way. I just give you two samples, white horse, not horse paradox, and this. Surely the tough case is a layer paradox. And also there's a different kind of the semantic paradox, right? I do not pretend I have not yet to explore all these specific cases, but I is modestly optimistic about this explanatory potency. Why? But however, I'm not too impressive about the layer paradox, because that's involves a different type of the contradiction, different from the real contradiction in the world. It's kind of the linguistic and the paradox and generally, and already in the market, we already have quite a few different solutions, Tarski's or a lot of. So it's but surely, so if we have time, probably that sad story, say something very basic about that. But point is, for one thing, traditionally people would like to deliver some point in a paradoxical way. I think it's I think there is a number of the reasons. The first thing, during the ancient time, people have yet to have the sufficient conceptual and explanatory resources to dissolve, and all those seemingly paradoxical appearance are really talked about. Okay, for another thing, positively, usually when you deliver some point in a paradoxical way, it seems to be powerful. I think why is it powerful? Because it captures some real contradiction, such as is illustrated by the change, motion in the real world. Because the changing and the motion in the real world, when the very powerful resources pushing our society, the world forward. So that's why it's when you deliver the point in a paradoxical way. But however, third point is we should not be deluded by the paradoxical appearance. So here I suggest is not based on some purely theoretical top and down resources like the artificial language to dissolve the its paradoxes. It's just based on our common sense, our already achieved the power of the human language, such as a double reference feature of our language. We have, and then with some further reflection, I think we have resources to, as one of the ending point, we are entitled to talk about even the real contradiction in a consistent way. So I think that's the original point of the principle of non-contradiction. Surely people use the term, the principle of non-contradiction in a different way in either the 2006 as the anthology edited by the Graham Price is people already analyze there is different kind of the principle non-contradiction, semantic, it's a syntactic, pragmatic, metaphysics, or something about that. Here, obviously, we when I said Aristotle's classical presentation, I talk about as a semantic principle because eventually involves the relationship between our language, thought, and reality. Yeah.
Okay, Martin.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you for your talk. I would just get a quick, probably follow-up, probably not. So there's the law of non-contradiction as one logical principle people want to deal with, whether on semantic or metaphysics level. But there is the reverse of law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle. And I was wondering if the same way of reasoning, because if we want to kind of run broad metaphysical facts and violate, say, the law of excluded middle, we are kind of committed to like broad indeterminacies in the world, right? Like the truth value gaps or whatever you call it. And I was just wondering if the same story would be applicable to the law of excluded middle rather than the law of non-contradiction.
Can you highlight your question, the point of your question in one statement?
Yeah, this is just a question that if the same story kind of could be found, which says something about the law of excluded middle, when we don't kind of face paradoxes, but we face kind of gaps, right? So,
yeah,
not glass,
okay.
but gaps, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the scope of this paper is actually is limited. There's another issue with one another is truth value gap. Here, I start with whether or not we can talk about the real contradiction in a consistent way. So that's my goal. And to what extent the principle of the deal with the truth value gap, there's another topic I can further think about. Yeah, thank you for your question. Okay.
All right, cheers.
Yeah. Okay.
Arno.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anand. Thank you both for such an interesting talk. That's a follow-up to Anand's question. See, the impression that I have, because as he mentioned, we find paradox in many traditions. So the impression that I have is that if people are creative enough, they are going to resolve the paradox, right? But on the other hand, right now, since you, as you mentioned, there are people like, I mean, in philosophy of religion, we have J.C. Bill, for instance, who defend a contradictory approach to some issues. In his case, in Christianity, really to accept the contradiction. So I'd like to hear from you because about that, because when people try to resolve the contradiction, they still have the principle of non-contradiction as like a basic criterion to evaluate and to accept or reject whatever approaches. But when we give this up, what is left? I mean, which kind of criterion we're going to have to accept or reject interpretations, explanations, approaches, wherever.
Yeah, my point here is as far as criterion, such as its Graham Priest highlight explain the number of the criterion to evaluate with one of the good account. My point here is the standard sense of consistency is still one of the important criterions. Instead of we need to give it up. His explanatory potency is already testified and very powerful. And my point is we can, as guided by the core point of the principle of the non-contradiction, surely in a refined way in terms of the double reference and the relative resources, can be still one of the major criteria for our talk about, including talk about the contradiction. And because here our one of our purpose is not just self-entertainment. We emphasize the mutual understanding and critical engagement. We need to have the common normative basis. I think that's being consistency in that standard way, at least as a re-characterized in terms of the refined principle of non-contradiction. Might serve as one of the normative basis for mutual understanding and effective critical engagement. Yeah. Thank you, Ricardo. Okay.
I think you sure want to ask a question, right?
Yeah, I'd like to ask the speaker about one thing, and he has brought up the liar paradox in his presentation, and while discussing the sense of contradiction found in Lao Zi's writings, and offered the theory of double reference. Now, instead of double reference, and the chair mentioned Saptavangi Nyaya, so instead of double, it's a sevenfold. I mean, it's still, the attempt is similar, that to remove the contradiction by drawing attention to the different points of view. So instead of double, it is sevenfold, but the basic thought is the same. However, 2 points, one of the commentators mentioned the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction. This is an old tradition coming from Aristotle himself and widely debated, by philosophers. Certainly widely debated in the Sanskrit logical tradition. They do not have the same standing. The law of non-contradiction has a higher standing in Aristotle's view. Clearly, he has argued for it in the posterior analytics than the law of excluded middle, and he has produced arguments for that. Aristotle himself, and there's a whole range of very, very powerful arguments in the Sanskrit logical tradition that shows that the two laws are not in the same standing. So the principle of non-contradiction has a higher standing, And we cannot compromise it. We have to take the sense of contradiction away by using different devices as double reference, etc., etc. Now, the liar paradox is not in the same league. The liar paradox is a different kind of paradox, in my opinion, very different logically from the kind of paradox that Lao Zi offers us, which are much more interesting philosophically. It goes much deeper and requires far more exploration. The liar paradox has been very famous. I will agree with you, a very large body of writing on that, but it can be resolved and I can be totally wrong on this, without much fuss. It can be resolved by making the distinction, as many have argued, between object language and meta language, in Sanskrit between bhasha and paribhasha. Paribhasha is a meta language. So I think that works. That's my view. Others can agree or disagree with that. But Lao Zi's paradoxes, the paradoxes about Brahman, are in a different league altogether. They are far more subtle. They are far more sophisticated, in my opinion, than the liar. And we should keep the two kinds of paradoxes separate. Anyway, that's my 2 cents worth of comment. I did really enjoy the presentation. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Kiso. Actually, I agree with you. Yeah, in the two connections, the first thing is, I don't think it's a liar paradox. It's as a same status as those paradox. It's talking about the real contradiction in the world. And also, I agree with what you see. It's in the literature we have already different available approaches, such as the Tarski's distinction between the object and the meta language. My personal, actually, I would not take the liar part as a very that dependent on focus and purpose. It's a different type of the paradox, and it's not have enjoyed the same status as other paradox regarding the real world. It's intrinsically related to our language, and but as for the language, we have already a number of the ready-made. It's a solution to that liar paradox. Yeah, I feel dislike the Tarski's distinction between the object mental language. So we have the Kripke's solution just within the same language. Yeah, and yeah, from a double reason point of view, so I give you very straightforward and how to look at that. For example, you even say this sentence is a false, right? So from double reference point, this sentence is false. Let's say any predicate, eventually it's a predicative, the comments on the double reference. Okay, so when you say this sentence is false, you double reference, you talk about the sentence as a whole with a focus on a specific attribute of the being false. So how does being false? We can follow the pre-theoretical understanding of the truth and the field to capture with things are whatever. So, and then question is, if you say the liar paradox is true or false, whether or not we can from a false infer true, true infer, it's not the case, right? For example, when you say this sentence is a false, okay, it's a false, I say yes. You just make a redundant comment. This sentence is a false, and then by another predicate comment, the false, just repeat this sentence is false. Okay, when you say this sentence is true, okay, by double reference you focus on because it's a conditional. If the liar paradox is true, okay, so this sentence is both true and false. So at the referential stage, there's a contradiction. But eventually, the ending story, the liar paradox, it will not produce that kind of the liar paradox. From a false, you infer truth. From a truth, you infer false. Yeah, this is a very rough possible it's a treatment in terms of the double reference account. Yeah. But I have, yeah. Oh, okay, go ahead.
No, please finish it.
Oh, I finished. I say, I'm thinking about that issue, but I have yet to put into the works. That's rough idea. I present it here. So, as a sad story, yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Anand, he had a connection problem, so I will continue. He had to leave us. And in fact, I'll have to end the session because our time is up. So thank you very much, both for your talk, for replying to our questions. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us. And so our next session would be August 17. The speech will be Fatima Amiji from the University of British Columbia, Canada. And she's going to speak about Quora and human rights. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Bo. And
thank you, Ricardo, and all of your common criticism. I benefit a lot. So I will think about the question further. Yeah. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Bye-bye,
thank you very
everyone.
much.